In Episode 6, Apply Proven Secure Design Principles in Practice, we bring the famous secure design principles out of posters and policy documents and into the daily decisions that engineers, architects, and reviewers actually make. Instead of treating them as exam vocabulary, we treat them as a vocabulary for making trade-offs visible and defensible. The intent is straightforward. When you look at a design, you should be able to name which principles are being respected, which are being strained, and where the gaps lie. That habit turns reviews from opinion debates into structured conversations grounded in well-understood ideas. It also makes the exam scenario questions feel like familiar territory rather than abstract puzzles. Least privilege sits at the heart of this mindset because it forces you to ask who or what genuinely needs access and at what level for work to get done. When applied relentlessly, it reduces the blast radius of compromise, misconfiguration, or simple human error, because no account or component carries more power than it truly requires. In practice, this shows up as carefully scoped roles, time-bound elevation for rare tasks, and separation between everyday accounts and privileged ones. It also shows up in design patterns that avoid giving broad database rights to application services when narrower permissions would suffice. Over time, least privilege becomes less about saying no and more about crafting precise, safe pathways to yes that still keep risk contained. Defense in depth complements least privilege by acknowledging that no single control is perfect and that failures are inevitable. Instead of trusting one gatekeeper, you place layered controls around identities, data, and operations, so that an attacker must clear several hurdles to cause real harm. These layers might include strong authentication, well-structured authorization, input validation, network segmentation, and monitoring that can recognize suspicious patterns. The key is that layers are thoughtfully chosen and independent enough that one failure does not automatically topple the others. When you evaluate a design, defense in depth encourages you to ask what happens when each layer fails and whether the remaining structure still meaningfully protects the system. Secure defaults push the design further by deciding what happens when nobody has made a conscious configuration choice yet. A secure default denies access until explicitly granted, logs events unless explicitly turned off, and uses safe protocols unless deliberately changed. This principle recognizes that real systems live in a world of rushed deployments, partial documentation, and gradual drift away from ideal states. When defaults lean towards safety, the system remains reasonably protected even when teams have not yet fine-tuned every setting. Reviewing a design through this lens means asking what behavior appears out of the box and whether that baseline would be acceptable if no further tuning occurred for quite some time. Failing securely deals with the reality that faults and exceptions will occur and that they can be either managed or exploited. A secure failure preserves the integrity and confidentiality of data, even when availability is temporarily impaired. For example, if an authorization engine times out, a secure failure would deny access and log the event rather than granting access by default to avoid user frustration. If an input validation library encounters an error, a secure failure would reject the transaction rather than passing data unchecked to downstream components. Thinking this way during design and test reviews helps you notice places where silent fallbacks or unchecked errors could turn a minor glitch into a serious security incident. Simplicity and economy of mechanism recognize that every piece of complexity you add is another place for misunderstandings, misconfigurations, and latent defects. Simple mechanisms are easier to reason about, easier to implement correctly, and easier to test and monitor over time. When design choices accumulate layers of special case behavior, hidden feature flags, or intricate dependency chains, even well-intentioned security controls become fragile. This does not mean that sophisticated systems must be simplistic. It means the security-critical paths should be as straightforward as possible. During a review, this principle invites you to ask whether a simpler approach could achieve the same security goals with fewer moving parts. Complete mediation insists that every access to a resource is checked against the current policy, instead of relying on cached assumptions that may no longer be valid. In practice, this means that once a user or service has been authenticated, each subsequent request to sensitive data or functions still goes through appropriate authorization checks. Problems appear when designs rely on session-wide decisions, stale role information, or client-side flags to determine what is allowed. If roles change, tokens are stolen, or context shifts, those cached assumptions become dangerous. Applying complete mediation as a lens prompts you to identify where decisions are made, how often they are revisited, and whether revocation or context changes are reflected promptly. Minimizing attack surface extends the idea of simplicity by focusing specifically on the number and variety of ways an attacker might interact with your system. Every feature, interface, protocol, and listening service is another potential entry point or foothold. This principle encourages you to remove unused features, consolidate overlapping interfaces, and limit exposure of administrative paths wherever possible. It also favors narrowing input formats and supported options to those the business genuinely needs. In a design review, attack surface thinking shows up in questions about why an interface must be public, why a feature must be enabled by default, or whether an internal capability could be split into smaller, more controlled pieces. Designing for privacy by default adds a complementary perspective focused on how and why data is collected, stored, and shared. Instead of asking what information could be useful someday, you ask what information is truly necessary for the stated purpose and how long it must be kept. Privacy by default limits collection, applies proportionate access controls, and structures data handling so that unnecessary identifiers are avoided or removed as early as possible. It also emphasizes transparency about use and a clear rationale for any processing that might surprise a reasonable person. In exam scenarios and real projects, this principle helps you distinguish between designs that merely protect data and designs that also respect people's expectations. Secure by design patterns and threat-informed reference architectures give you reusable templates that embody these principles systematically. Rather than reinventing basic access control flows, data protection schemes, or deployment topologies, you draw from patterns that have already been scrutinized and tested. Threat-informed architectures explicitly consider likely attack paths, known weaknesses, and regulatory expectations, then arrange controls in ways that mitigate those risks. Using these patterns consistently lowers the risk of overlooking obvious safeguards and speeds up design work because you are not starting from scratch each time. When evaluating or describing a system, referencing such patterns helps show that security has been considered from the earliest stages, not bolted on later. Trust but verify rounds out the security mindset by acknowledging that, while trust relationships are necessary, they must be supported by evidence. Verification can take the form of attestations from components, proofs of code integrity, runtime checks that configurations match expectations, or periodic tests that simulate misuse. This principle applies to external dependencies, such as cloud services or third-party libraries, and to internal ones, such as shared platforms or critical microservices. Over time, trust but verify helps prevent quiet erosion of controls as changes accumulate and assumptions become outdated. In exam questions, It often appears where you are asked to choose actions that validate security posture rather than simply relying on initial design intentions. Testing negative scenarios explicitly closes the loop by asking how systems behave when inputs are malformed, conditions are hostile, or supporting infrastructure misbehaves. Many teams are comfortable testing success paths, but attackers and real-world failures tend to live in the neglected corners. Negative testing includes trying invalid credentials, unexpected data formats, high-volume requests, partial outages, and misordered workflows to see whether the system degrades gracefully. It also checks that errors do not leak sensitive information and that logging and alerting behave as intended when things go wrong. Integrating this thinking into routine testing cycles makes the earlier principles tangible and measurable. At this point, a mini-review can help consolidate the landscape. You can name the principles, describe concrete examples, and note trade-offs and verification approaches that connect them. Least privilege and attack surface reduction both limit exposure, but in different ways, while defense in depth and complete mediation ensure that protections remain effective even when conditions change. Secure defaults and fail-secure behaviors shape what happens when nobody has tuned the system carefully or when components misbehave. Privacy by default and secure by design patterns add human and architectural dimensions that prevent narrow technical fixes from dominating the conversation. Trust but verify and negative testing then provide the mechanisms that prove these ideas are more than slogans. The conclusion for Episode 6 is deliberately practical. Choose one principle to emphasize in your work today and translate it into a simple checklist you can embed in design and review conversations. That checklist might be a handful of questions you ask during every review, or a short set of conditions a design must meet before moving forward. The next action is to schedule time to introduce that checklist into an upcoming review or planning session, so it moves from a personal intention to a shared practice. As you repeat this with other principles over time, secure design guidance becomes woven into the culture of your teams. In turn, exam scenarios that reference these principles will feel like familiar reflections of the decisions you already help shape. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.